Okay, well, last time we stopped abruptly. I got to the last verse of chapter 3 of Judges with the one verse that refers to the judge whose name is Shamgar, and should have finished that. But I thought first of all I would put the map back up on the screen, and I think it's helpful if we look at this a bit. Um, we saw last time Othniel, who's down here in Judah, and then Ehud, who actually was from Benjamin. He crossed over at Jericho into the territory of Gad, which is where the king of Moab, Eglon, was, where he assassinated him. And then a battle raged later back over on the main side of the Jordan River. Tonight we'll look at Shamgar. Then we have Deborah and Barak. Deborah was down here in the area of Bethel, reigning as a judge and prophetess. But then the battle actually took place up in this area of the area of Megiddo, the Valley of Jezreel. That's where Barak and the armies actually met. So then, let's see, then we'll probably have time to look at Gideon, who is up here in this area of Ophrah, which actually appears to be right on the border of the western half of Manasseh, and that's Issachar underneath there. I did get a simple chart put together. I'll scroll on up here. By the way, this map, if you go to the Bible commentary, the section on Judges chapter 1 has this map, if you want to pull that up and look at it further sometime. But I did get my chart together, just listing on the left column the 12 judges, the scriptural reference. Now, once in a while, there's a skip of a few verses, and that's generally where the story, after there was a deliverance, then they started going downhill once again, and then it'll pick it up where God raises up somebody else. The third column shows the number of years that Israel then, or that part of Israel, had rest. So often it'll say that, Othniel judged 40 years they had peace, or they had rest from their enemies. So Othniel, 40 years. Ehud, there was 80 years of peace after the battle there that he was involved with. Shamgar, we just aren't told much at all in that one verse. So anyhow, you can see the numbers of the years down the line. If need be, I can email this to you later, because I want to get the text of Judges up on the screen next. Far right column has the main tribe or tribes as they were involved. So, okay, let me take this back down, and I want to put up the text of Scripture. Okay, hold on just a moment here. Okay, can you see clearly that on your screen? Okay, great. Just like a little feedback on that. So in the end of chapter 3 of Judges, verse 31, is this man Shamgar. After him was Shamgar, the son of Anath. Now, that really doesn't tell us anything, even as far as what tribe he was in. I should have pointed out when the map was up there that way up in Naphtali, there is a city that is named Beth Anath. And in the Hebrew, that means the house of Anath. So on the map, they had his name way up high there, northern part of ancient Israel, just based on an assumption that perhaps his deliverance took place up there. But it tells us he killed 600 men of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel. So again, we don't know where it was, but wow, what a guy. You want to meet this fellow coming down the dark alley. 600 men with an ox goad. Now, I have here the Life Application Bible, and they have a note here about an ox goad. Archaeologists have found some. They were around 8 feet in length, and it says that it was a long stick with a small flat piece of iron on one side with a sharp point coming out the other side. The sharp side was used to prod the oxen while they were tilling the field. And then the flat end was used to clean the mud or dirt off of some of their farm equipment. And it mentions that oftentimes in time of crisis, these were used as spears. So Shamgar, that's all we know about him. He's our judge number 3. So let's go ahead and move to chapter 4 and look at the story of Deborah, who is the judge, but also as the story is told, the military commander is Barak. And he's a man who seems a bit hesitant. He seemed to have some insecurities, but then God used Deborah to kind of prod him on and encourage him. And you know, that just speaks to the way I think there's a basic need within men. I know I could say I know I'm that way. That when we do a job, whether it's home repair, whether it's construction, whatever it is, giving a message in church, we need support, and we need that and hunger for that from our partner in life. So he seems to be that way. So in chapter 4, when Ehud was dead, okay, he was the one we read about in chapter 3 just before Shamgar. The children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So we're starting a new cycle. We mentioned last time they would go from sin to punishment and oppression, and then to repentance, and then they'd cry out and God would raise up someone to deliver them. So the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Now, Hazor is up in far northern Israel, above the Sea of Galilee, or toward that area. Then it says the commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt at Hareshet Hagayim. I did look up, don't know what that means, but anyhow, you have these individuals are way up in the northern part of Israel, the area of Naphtali, and then down toward the western part of the tribe of Manasseh. Verse 3. The children of Israel cried out to the Lord, for Jabin had, notice, 900 chariots of iron, and for 20 years he had harshly oppressed the children of Israel. Now, I think there's a note I can follow and get back to chapter 1 quickly. In Judges 1, verse 19, where it's talking about the tribe of Judah going out and occupying their land, it discusses part of the land they took possession of. But then in verse 19, so the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, But then notice, they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland, because they had chariots of iron. Now, through the story of Deborah and Barak, God is going to stress to them that having even 900 chariots of iron is no problem to God. God had promised them while Moses was still, rather while Joshua was still alive, that God would go and first he would fight the battles for them. He would drive the peoples away. And yet, repeatedly, they take their eyes off of God and they start looking at the enemy and they start to panic. It's human nature. We do it too, just in a different way at a different time. So 900 chariots of iron for the 20 years he harshly oppressed the children of Israel. So you think of this 20 years, how long does it take for God to get their attention so that they then cry out to God? Well, as I said a while ago, we do the same thing. We have things, our battles often are between these ears of ours in the mind. And there are times we get comfortable with, we allow sin and weakness to remain, and we do not act with urgent struggle to get out of that, to throw off the shackles of our past. So in verse 4, we are introduced to Deborah. Now, Deborah, a prophetess. Now, Miriam was called a prophetess. Miriam also wrote a song. We'll see the next chapter that Deborah wrote a beautiful song after the deliverance God gave them. The wife of Lapidoth was judging Israel at that time. And she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel. Now, Ramah, I'm drawing a blank on that. Wasn't that Samuel's home place? Anyhow, it's a number of miles north of Jerusalem. So it's it's above the area of Benjamin, right around the border as you start getting into the tribe of Ephraim's territory. Ramah and Bethel and the mountains of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. Verse 6, and she sent and called for Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali. Well, Naphtali is up in the far north to the west and above the Sea of Galilee. So she's down here in the central part, miles north of Jerusalem, and he's way up in the northern part of the country. So she called for him and said, has not the Lord God of Israel commanded, go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor and take 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and the sons of Zebulun. So Naphtali was up to the west of the Sea of Galilee, Zebulun just below them, and then Asher was over on the Mediterranean Sea coast. So through whatever means God reveals to her, get Barak, get an army together. I'm going to give you a deliverance. Now, Mount Tabor is in the area of the Valley of Jezreel. Further west is Megiddo, but it is that long valley that is the gathering place of armies at the time of the end. A lot of battles in the Bible took place in the area around Megiddo in that valley. So, verse 7, and against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, and with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, I will deliver him into your hand. So again, the wording is important. God will give this army into their hands. God will fight the battle. God will deliver them. Verse 8, Verse 8, and Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. So again, little hesitant. He wanted some reassurance. He wanted to, and I think there's something humanly, you want to see a human leader that God was working through. You know, many of us on here tonight, we have vivid memories of the ministry of Mr. Armstrong. And on those occasions when I was a teenager, you know, when he'd walk in on the stage at the feast at Big Sandy, it was just like, you know, we know God's tool is here, God's shepherd is here. And it had a very settling effect on everyone. And so, anyhow, verse 9, so she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you. So, Barak, if you're into this battle to get the glory, you're not going to get any. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. So the judge of Israel was a woman, and later in the story, a woman will be the one who actually will take the life of this general named Sisera. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. Let me scroll this up. Verse 10, and Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh. He went with 10,000 men under his command, and Deborah went up with him. Now we have Heber the Kenite, of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses. So could be another name for Jethro, could be a title, but these are from the Midianites. Moses went and dwelt among the Midianites and herded flocks for those 40 years. And had separated himself from the Kenites. Now, the basic Kenites were down in the territory of Judah, but he had taken his family or his clan and moved way up north into this area of the valley of Jezreel. Pitched his tent near the terebinth tree at Zaanaim, which is beside Kadesh. Verse 12, and they reported to Sisera. So some of the Kenites who were peacefully dwelling there among the Israelites actually reported to Sisera what was going on. He reported to Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera gathered together all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the people who were with him, from Harosheth Ayagoyim to the river Kishon. The river Kishon is the river that goes kind of southeast to northwest through the valley of Jezreel. So once again, going to be a gathering place, a staging ground for armies to do battle. So in verse 14, and Deborah said to Barak, up, you know, she's saying, okay, come on, get up. The stage is set, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you? So God's got this. You just have to lead the armies and follow. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. Now, we're going to see a little later, the numbers were many, many times that, who were there with Sisera's army. So, verse 15, and the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army and fled away on foot. Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. So it's interesting what the Jewish historian Josephus adds on this story from the Antiquities of the Jews. He mentions that there was a torrential rain, it got colder. Hailstones fell on Sisera's army. The the weather made their hands cold as far as using a bow or a sling. The water stretched some of the leather, and their bows were coming unstrung, and their slings would not work. So, God's the one who said, I'll drive them out before you. So all of this is God's doing. Then you have a torrential rainfall, so you have chariots with heavy iron wheels that are not made to go through mud. So, verse 16, but Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Haggayim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. Verse 17. However, Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Eber the Kenite. So I was reading in the Life Application Bible, it mentions that the women of the clan were generally the ones who set up tents. And when you have the women's dwelling place, that was off limits to any man. But he went there, and she gave him what appeared to be a safe hiding place. So there was peace between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. Verse 18, and Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not fear. And when he had turned aside with her into the tent, she covered him with a blanket. Well, the marginal note says it was a rug. So verse 19, then he said to her, he asked for water. She brought him a jug of milk, gave him a drink, covered him up. And verse 20, he said, stand at the door of the tent. If anyone comes, just say no. Well, then verse 21, Heber's wife Jael took a tent peg, took a hammer in her hand, and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple, and it went down into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary. So this is where, as Deborah had told Barak, the glory you might be thinking of is going to go to another woman, and that's this Jael. Verse 22, Barak has been pursuing the army. He's looking for Sisera. He comes, and then Jael goes and tells him, come and I'll show you where he is. And of course, he was already dead with this tent peg all the way through his head. Verse 23, so on that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, in the presence of the children of Israel, which to me reads that Israel was basically there watching what God did, and then they went and cleaned up afterward. The hand of the children of Israel grew stronger and stronger against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. Now that's the basic battle. Now we shift. Chapter 5 is a beautiful song that is written by Deborah, and just tremendous poetic value to it, and just the way it is put together is just amazing. I think a lot of times when we talk about poetry from Hebrew, when it's translated into English, there's a lot that we lose. Many times in Hebrew, there may be an acrostic, and where the order of the consonants, one verse will start with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and then the second verse with the second one, all the way through 22 consonants. But as it's translated, we totally lose that, just the beautiful poetic value. So Deborah and Barak sang that day. Verse 2, when leaders lead in Israel, when the people willingly offer themselves, Bless the Lord. So this is kind of like the prelude of a song as far as the lyrics, various stanzas that are going to follow. Um, Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. Even I, will sing to the Lord. I'll sing praise to the Lord God of Israel. So here it begins by giving praise to God, the one who gave the victory. Lord, when you went out of Seir. Now, Seir, Mount Seir is way down to the south below the Dead Sea, the area of Edom, where Edom dwelt. Sometimes in prophecy, it'll talk about Esau or Edom or the land of Idumea, or it may refer to Mount Seir, and it's all talking about the same area. But it's also the area where Mount Sinai most likely was. And it mentions Sinai here in the next verse. And it's as though God came from the holy mountain to come to do battle. When you marched from the field of Edom, the earth trembled, the heavens poured, the clouds poured water. So it probably there it's verifying some of the records that Josephus had written down. The mountains gushed before the Lord, this Sinai before the Lord God of Israel. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anak, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted. The travelers walked along the byways. So the last couple of lines there, it's talking about how heavy the oppression was and how the Israelites lived in such fear that they wouldn't go down the normal main highways. They were going the back roads. They were going stealthily to save their lives. Village life ceased. It ceased in Israel until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. You know, sometimes, and ladies, don't take this wrong, but sometimes the best man in the nation is someone here like Deborah. You know, Golda Meir was that way back in the early years of the modern nation of Israel. Mr. Armstrong went and met with her, and she truly was a very, very strong leader, and she was looked to as the mother of Israel. A number of years ago, of course, Great Britain had Margaret Thatcher, and even Mikhail Gorbachev called her the Iron Lady. And she referred to that once and said, "And that I am." And she was a very strong leader. So, verse 8, they chose new gods. Then there was war in the gates. Not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. My heart is with the rulers of Israel who offer themselves willingly with the people. Bless the Lord. Then verse 10. Verse 10. Speak, you who ride on white donkeys, who sit in judges' attire, who walk along the road. Now, the leaders, generally the highest ones, would ride on white donkeys or sometimes mules, a cross between a horse and a donkey. Far from the noise of the archers among the watering places, there they shall recount the righteous acts of the Lord, the righteous acts for the villagers in Israel. Then the people of the Lord shall go down to the gates. So verse 12, kind of another prelude, setting the stage once again. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, sing a song. Arise, Barak, lead your captives away, O son of Abinoam. Anyhow, verse 14, it's interesting. It mentions some other tribes that apparently sent some warriors, or maybe they joined the battle after the initial overthrow. From Ephraim were those whose roots were in Amalek. After you, Benjamin, with your peoples. From Machir, Machir, that was one of the sons of Manasseh. So apparently looking at that western area of Manasseh. From Zebulun, those who bear the recruiter's staff. Verse 15, the princes of Issachar were with Deborah. As Issachar, so was Barak sent into the valley under his command. Among the divisions of Reuben, there were great resolves of heart. So it kind of is worded like Reuben was uncertain. Do we join the fray or do we stay back? Verse 16, why did you sit among the sheep fields to hear the pipings for the flocks? The divisions of Reuben have great searchings of heart. So it reads like they decided, no, we're going to stay here and look after our sheep, and did not join the battle. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan. And why did Dan remain on ships? So not all of Israel was engaged in this battle. It says Gilead, now that's that area across. Remember, you had the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh over on the other side of the Jordan. Those over in Gilead stayed home. And let's see, why did Dan remain on ships? Dan was over on the coast. They were a seafaring tribe, and they didn't come join the battle. So why did Dan remain on ships? Asher continued at the seashore and stayed by his inlets. Verse 18, Zebulun is a people who jeopardized their lives to the point of death. Naphtali also on the heights of the battlefield. So Zebulun and Naphtali, those were the two tribes where Barak sent out a call, and the army came primarily from them, but obviously other tribes joined in to a degree. Verse 19, the kings came and fought. Kings of Canaan fought in Taanach by the waters of Megiddo. They took no spoils of silver. They fought from the heavens, the stars from their courses fought against Sisera. And it's thought, and this is very likely, is a reference to the angelic heavenly hosts who were there actually doing the battle and giving Barak and the army the deliverance. Verse 21, the torrent of Kishon swept them away. So there again, this river that really is not much of a river at all. It's more of a wet season river, and yet it talks of torrents. And so that would validate what I read or referred to from Josephus as far as the torrential rainfall. Let's see, verse 22, then the horses' hooves pounded, the galloping of his steeds. Curse Meraz, said the angel of the Lord, curse its inhabitants bitterly, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, to the help of the Lord against the mighty. Then verse 24, Deborah sings of Jael. Most blessed among women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, and then refers to how she welcomed the Sisera into the tent and then took his life. And let's see, verse 28, there's 3 verses there, as if it's looking through the eyes of the mother of Sisera back wherever her home was. The mother of Sisera looked through the window and cried out through the lattice, why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarries the clatter of his chariots? Her wisest ladies answered her. Yes, she answered herself. Verse 30, are they not finding and dividing the spoil? So she's thinking the great victory she thinks her son has led, that they're now dividing the spoil, and it's taking a long time, not knowing that her son's been killed in battle and the army has been routed. And goes on speaking of dividing the dyed garments and embroidered garments. Verse 31, thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the sun when it comes out in its strength, in full strength. So the land had rest for 40 years. So as the chart I had it there on the screen a while ago, the victory led to Israel having rest from their problems. Now, again, I think I mentioned this in the introduction, but remember, each of these judges, it's in a certain portion of the tribes. It is not uniformly across all of the tribes. So there may have been peace and rest in this area, and at the same time, maybe say Judah was having trouble with the Philistines. So we've got to keep that in mind. It's not like, add the 80 years of Othniel and add 40 years of Deborah and 40 years of Gideon. It's not that easy. It's not easy to follow the chronology because we just aren't given all the pieces of the puzzle. Okay, I'd also like to look at Gideon here tonight. Once again, the early verses here of chapter 6, it's just amazing. It doesn't seem to take long, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. So this is a certain area, a certain region. This turns out to be in the area of the western half tribe of Manasseh, but also where it's kind of right around the Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali region. So the verse 2, the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made for themselves the dens, the caves, the strongholds which are in the mountains. So very bleak oppression. They're finding a cave, cleaning it out, clearing it out, and making it a place they can live in. Probably just not safe down in their cities or in their own homes that may have been scattered. Verse 3, so it was when Israel had sown, the Midianites would come up. Also Amalekites, and the people of the east would come up against them. So actually there are several different peoples from across the Jordan who would come and invade whenever they knew it's time for a harvest or time for some other type of production. They would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza. So Gaza is over in the area of the Philistines, way over close to the Mediterranean Sea, and leave no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep nor ox nor donkey. So any of their livestock, any of their beasts, the burdens, they just haul them off. Verse 5, for they would come up with their livestock and their tents, coming in as numerous as locusts. Both they and their camels were without number. They would enter the land to destroy it. So Israel, verse 6, was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Well, this time it only took 7 years of oppression, and they cry out to God. Verse 7, it came to pass when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord because of the Midianites, that the Lord sent a prophet to the children of Israel, who said to them, thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of bondage, and I delivered you. God always gives a warning, and he gives it over and over and over. And drove them out and gave you their land. Verse 10, also I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. So God sends a prophet to let them know your punishment is because you have disobeyed. You've taken your eyes off of me. And that brings us in verse 11 to Gideon. Now the angel of the Lord came. Now, sometimes you notice here in the New King James, they They use the capital or the uppercase A for angel. This is one of the places we will see a little later in Gideon speaking with this angel. We come to realize this is actually the God of the Old Testament, the pre-incarnate Christ. And he recognizes that shortly. He sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, I should say, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Now, a number of clues are given there that are good to point out. This area of Ophrah is up and far northern of the western Manasseh territory up against Issachar. But from what we saw above, because of the oppression, because the Midianites would come and take whatever produce was being harvested at a given time, he is threshing wheat, which is normally done. They'd find a flat, open, rocky area, and they would lay out all of their sheaves, and they would pull sleds over it with animals, knocking the grain out of the heads. And then they would go through the winnowing process of throwing the grain up in the air and the wind blowing away the chaff. But he has what must be a very small amount of wheat, and he is gleaning that by hand in a wine press. And it was so he would be hidden from the Midianites. But verse 12, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. Gideon said to him, O my Lord. Now, actually, the word used here is Adoni, A-D-O-N-I. And that one in the Hebrew is like sir or master. We might call someone, well, sir. But it's very close to Adonai, which is the word, which is the name of God, which he uses just a little bit later when he realizes I'm in the presence of God. If the Lord, and that's the tetragrammaton, the YHVH, if Yahweh is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about? Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. Well, that was true. God had brought them out. And yet Israel had turned away from God. And oftentimes in this book, they turn even to other gods. And so because of their sins, they were cut off. And God left them alone to pay the price of their own sins. Verse 14, and then the Lord turned to him. So here it tells us, and that's in the Hebrew Yahweh, then the Lord turned to him. So that connects the dots. This story, the angel of the Lord. Now, every place that you see that in the Bible, it doesn't mean, it might mean just one of God's angelic messengers. But in this case, and in many cases, this specifically is the pre-incarnate Christ. The Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? So God's telling him, is anything too hard for me? I'm sending you. I'm going to give you a great victory. You just have to go. But Gideon, we see, was also a man who had his insecurities. He wanted reassurance. He actually then wants miracles. And then he said, oh, by the way, how about another one, just so I'll know you're really going to go with us. So verse 15. So he said to him, oh, my Lord. And this is where he actually uses the Hebrew Adonai as a name of God. He's not just saying Adoni, meaning sir. He's using Adonai as one of God's names. Oh, my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm least in my father's house. Well, God was calling the weak of the world then, just as he's calling the weak of the world today. And so God assures him, I'll be with you. You'll defeat the Midianites as one man. It's interesting as this story unfolds. We humans, we like to look at numbers. We like to count heads. You know, there's one time when David brought a great curse. A lot of people lost their lives, where he had asked Joab to go and, number the men of war. Apparently, and the Bible doesn't really say, but apparently he was counting heads, trying to figure out, can we go out and initiate warfare on our own? And so it was not an act of faith. So God's going to show through this story, let the ones who are afraid go home. And then you still have too many, and he pares it down to 300. And it doesn't matter if it's 300 or just one. God's the one who was going to give the victory. So, verse 17, he asks this Lord to wait, and he was going to go prepare an offering. Verse 19, he prepared a young goat, unleavened bread, from an ephah of flour. So, probably that was very precious. And so it was going to hurt. Gideon was giving an offering that would have hurt the bleak stores of food that the family had. So it was all prepared, and he brought it back. In verse 20, the angel of the Lord said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread, lay them on this rock, pour out the broth. And Gideon did that. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of his staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and the fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And the angel of the Lord departed from his sight. And so verse 22, Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. And he said, alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. So he thought, I'm a dead man. I have looked on God. But then verse 23, God speaks back to him again. Peace be with you. Do not fear. You will not die. Verse 24, he built an altar. He called it. In the Hebrew, this is, they translate it Yahweh Shalom, the God of peace. The God of peace. And to this day, it is in Ophrah of the Abizarites. So when probably Samuel was completing the editing of the book, that was an editorial note that, that altar is still there to this day. So verse 25, God has him take his father's young bull, second bull of 7 years old, tear down the altar of Baal that your father has. So even his father was worshiping Baal, and built an altar to the Lord your God on top of this rock. So again, I'll just skim over some of this. Verse 27, he took 10 men. Notice they went out at night. They did it by night. They feared the men of his father's household. So, verse 28, men of the city arose early in the morning. There was the altar of Baal torn down, the wooden image beside it cut down. Second bull was being offered on the altar, which had been built. Only this time it was being offered to the true God of Israel. So they're wondering who did this, who brought this about, and they tell him it was Gideon. Bring your son that he may die. But the father stood against him. Would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Verse 31, let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. Okay, verse 32, the men of the city then called him Jerubbaal. Jerubbaal, meaning let Baal plead. Let Baal plead. So his name is Gideon, but they're going to call him Jerubbaal. Let Baal plead against him because he's torn down his altar. Then all the Midianites and Amalekites, the people of the east, so once again, a gathering of a number of peoples, gathered together, crossed over, and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. Well, here's this same battleground once again. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, then he blew the trumpet, and the Abiezrites, that's his own people, gathered behind him. He sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, who also gathered beside him. He sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up. So then the latter verses of chapter 6, Gideon wants a sign, and then he wants another sign. So we have the story of the fleece that was filled with dew while the ground was dry, and then the reverse. And verse 40, so God did so that night. It was dry on the fleece only, but there was dew on all the ground. So I suppose this apparently encouraged Gideon to let him know that, yes, this is God's will, and he is a bit more of a compliant servant in the next chapter. In chapter 7, we have the story where the numbers are pared down. We started here with 32,000, and God tells him in verse 2, the people who are with you are too many. And so he didn't want Israel to be able to claim glory for the battle. And so in verse 3, proclaim in the hearing of the people, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. So, and there actually was an allowance in the Old Testament law that if someone wanted an exemption because they're just scared to death, it was realized that you have someone who gets really spooked and they're gonna flee in the heat of battle. That is a very contagious attitude. So better to let them just go home, get out of the way, lest you lose half your army. So they're left with 10,000. And then verse 4, we began the story where they're to go down to the water, watch how they drink. Some went down and lapped the water as a dog laps, and others put their hand down, brought water up to their mouth. It's not really known why. The different theories, the one that makes sense to me is that the ones who are not, if you have your face right down there at the water, then you're not on guard, you're not watching. But you might go and squat down beside the water and bring water up to your mouth, and your eyes, you can still look around, be aware of any danger. So we really just aren't told. So by this action, verse 6 tells us the number was 300 who brought the water up to their face. But all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water, and of course the 300 were the ones that God selected. End of verse 7, let all the other people go, every man to his place. So that left the 300. So in verse 9, it's like God wanted to give Gideon even a bit more reassurance, a bit more. And so he tells him, well, go down to the camp of this assembled army of the enemy, and go down and just do some intel work and listen to hear what they're saying. So he went down with his servant, and verse 12, the Midianites and Amalekites, the people of the east, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts. Their camels were without number as the sand of the seashore, which might have been a bit disconcerting because Gideon realized my army was just carved down to 300. But verse 13, when Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. So again, we've got to remember there's the aspect of spiritual warfare. The angelic host of God was there. Somebody has a bad dream. I've had a dream, to my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled onto the camp of Midian. I mean, it sounds like a crazy dream, but it was really got this guy's attention. He came to a tent and struck it so it fell and overturned. The tent collapsed. Verse 14, and the companion answered and said, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. So it's like, you know, they're getting spooked, and their eyes, you can imagine, getting bigger and bigger. And even though they have every reason to believe the battle is going to be a piece of cake in their favor, they're getting scared. So verse 15, Gideon heard the telling of the dream. He worshiped. He returned to the camp. He said, arise, the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand. So verse 16, he divided the 300 into 3 companies. You know, it was where they surrounded the camp of the enemy to give the appearance when the shofar, the ram's horn, trumpets were blown. It would sound like they're surrounded by the enemy, by the Israelites. So a trumpet in every man's hand. The word there in the Hebrew is shofar. It's the ram's horn trumpet. With empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. So it's like they had a large clay pot, maybe with a handle, and inside they had some, well, we would think of a candle. They had some type of a light in there. So verse 17, look at me and do likewise. Verse 18, when I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets on every side of the camp and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And so, verse 19, they blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers. And of course, they blow the trumpet and then they break a pitcher, and here they're holding a light. And the whole thing just completely disoriented and upset the enemy. Verse 21, every man stood in his place all around the camp. The whole army ran and cried and fled. And the 300 blew the trumpets. The Lord set every man's sword against his companion. So all the Amalekites, Midianites, they're all fighting each other, killing themselves. The army fled to Beth Acacia towards Zeberah, as far as the border. Anyhow, verse 23, the men of Israel gathered together from Naphtali, Asher, all of Manasseh, and pursued the Midianites. And then Gideon sent messengers through the mountains of Ephraim. The Ephraimites came, they seized some of the water crossing there of the Jordan. And verse 25, they captured 2 princes, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. And they pursued Midian and brought the heads of the 2 kings to Gideon. So, chapter 8 just adds a little bit here. The men of Ephraim, you know, why didn't you call us? We wanted to get into the battle too. You know, they came in later and seized some of the river crossings. But Gideon handled it very tactfully. Verse 2, what have I done in comparison to you? Is not the gleaning of grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison to you? And their anger toward him subsided. So they, anyhow, this, yeah, I thought we would finish the part here with Gideon, but I'm going to take this down. I was working earlier. Let me at least show you just a little bit of some of the ideas I was coming across as I was looking at some of these stories. And hope you can see the chart of the kings, the judges once again. But just, there's some lessons here from just what we've seen thus far in these, into 8 chapters of the book. But, we see that God repeatedly warns his people. He always warns. And then he warns and warns again. And Israel didn't learn. They didn't listen. And if we don't learn from our mistakes, we're fated to repeat the same process. It's never too late. One story here, they were oppressed 20 years. Another one, it was 7 years of what seemed like a more intense oppression. And then they cried out to God. Why does it take us so long? Well, it's never too late, though. Wake up, repent, cry out to God for help, and with his strength, make lasting changes. But we've been warned, and today is our day of salvation. Another thought is remember God's mighty works. Don't ever, these are brought up and referred to throughout this book. Remember the mighty works of God, how he brought us out of Egypt, how, all the miracles. And, we don't have all the chronological pieces of the puzzle for the period of the judges, but Othniel, who's the first one, he was I think last time I said a younger brother. Actually, he was a brother. He was a son of a brother of Caleb. He was a nephew of Caleb. It is possible that he could have grown up through the wilderness years. I think it's unlikely. It's even possible, though, he was old enough to have crossed the Red Sea at a very young age. Others who came along later would have been born in the promised land as the tribes inherited and occupied. But each generation needs to pass along to the family the story of how God has called us and worked in our lives. Each of these judges, in their own imperfect way, did serve as a type for Jesus Christ, who is the ultimate deliverer of mankind from sin. And Christ delivers us. And we have our own unique stories, different ways, at different times, by different means that God intervenes for us, delivers us. And we need to remember those stories and tell them to the next generations. Another thought that I was working on here is that relationships affect our faith. Repeatedly, they would intermarry with some of the unbelieving peoples around them, and that just welcomes the world into your house. And there are many things we can do to open the door for the world to come into our mind. If we have a constant diet of the influence of the world, it leads to idolatry, because we're going to put something in front of God somewhere down the line. But unless we engage the battle and stay in the battle, the world's going to pull us under. Israel did not entirely drive out the idolatrous inhabitants. They let them stay. And if we allow the world to stay in our life, then we're in grave danger as well. So relationships are extremely important. Another thought here, let me just share these two very quickly. Don't wait so long to cry out for help. 20 years, 7 years, they're digging the hole deeper and deeper. But only when life became unbearable, they cried out to God. But calling to God should be our automatic first default reaction. And sometimes we deceive ourselves thinking, oh, I got a handle on this. And the world is putting its shackles around us more firmly. We've got to renew that inner man or woman every day and stay close to God. And then finally, is anything too hard for the Lord? Actually, that's a quote that came from the story of where Sarah was told she was going to have a baby, and Abraham and Sarah both laughed, and the statement was made, is anything too hard for the Lord? Well, the tribe of Judah stopped occupying their territory because the Philistines had chariots of iron. Well, God showed through Deborah and Barak that the assembled armies that had 900 chariots of iron, there was no weapon too strong for God. So stay close to God. Let Him lead your battle against Satan, sin, and the society around us. Okay, I'll take that down.